Shepard. Thank you. You may begin.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Advanced Practitioner Series. My name is Patrick Shepard. Very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Kane-Piasecki. And Cheryl, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, believe it or not, Patrick, we are once again going to be talking about free attendance and how that applies in the context of 31 USC 1353 and the widely attended gathering exception, among other authorities. And I say that because it's a presentation that I've given on multiple occasions at multiple conferences with Lenny Lowentritt. It's an evolving topic in some respects. Right. In fact, we just did it back in, we did an Advanced Practitioner series on this back in August of 2014.
It seems to be an area that continuously causes confusion, and I think it's because it's a tough area to navigate, and some seemingly small details can make a large difference in our analysis. So it's always good to think about these things, because I think people are right to sometimes feel overwhelmed.
Yes, I would agree. I would agree completely. But because we had Lenny here last month for the Advanced Practitioner Series, Lenny Lowentritt, who of course many of you know is the Deputy General Counsel at the General Services Administration, he was here to talk to us about all things travel, and he is the maven of all things travel. But I noticed in that presentation that many, if not most, of the questions that came out of that session involved particularities about 1353 and whether or not 1353 would allow for a permit for certain types of payments and under what circumstances the payments would be allowed. So we're going to try to address some of those. I mean, Lenny addressed them in his presentation, and I'm going to reiterate what Lenny said, but we're going to try and flesh those out, I think, a little bit more for folks today.
And I think to have a little more time to discuss some of these intricacies is very helpful, because these are things that come up for folks a lot.
Yes, absolutely. So do we have any announcements today, Patrick?
Just that please be on the lookout at the beginning of December for the registration invitations for the Fundamental Series and Advanced Practitioner Series. We will be holding those as usual. Topics TBD. So if you have suggestions, as always, please complete your course evaluations. If you have suggestions for future training, we're happy to be responsive to those. In fact, this session is partly the result of your requests for more information about this topic on last month's course evaluations. So we listen, and we do want to provide you the training that you ask for.
Absolutely.
So
okay.
Should we pull up the slides?
Yeah, if you could pull up the deck Excellent. For me, that would be awesome. So yeah, so 1353 in WAG, as I said, is something that that causes a tremendous amount of confusion for folks, for whatever reason. So, you know, and the person's face on here, actually, I'm very sympathetic with, because as I was putting this presentation together yesterday, this is kind of a reflection of exactly how I was feeling by the time I was finished doing it. But what I've really tried to do in this presentation, and every time I do this presentation, I come at it from a slightly different angle, because I keep trying to suss out what is it in particular that people seem to get wrapped around the axle on? What is it that seems to be causing the confusion? Where is the point of uncertainty, or where do the questions arise? And so I'm going to take another shot at it in a completely different way than I've ever done this before. And hopefully it will resonate with some folks. If this iteration of the presentation doesn't work for you, like if I miss you completely,
it's likely we're going to do this again.
It's likely we're going to do it again. But also, you can go back on max.gov. Last year, August of 2014, we did a different iteration of this presentation that maybe will resonate with you better. So we're just trying to do our best to see if we can't get to the bottom of this. And I will say, and I want to talk about this just a little bit by way of sort of history. I think part of the confusion that folks have with 1353 and its relationship to other authorities is that there was a fundamental misapprehension about the breadth and scope of 1353 and what you could even use 1353 to accept, particularly with respect to the waiver of registration fees. So back in the day, back in the early days, in the incipient sort of like days of the standards of conduct, I think a lot of folks misapprehended that 1353 would not allow you to accept waiver of attendance fees. So people were scurrying in 1353 situations. They were accepting the transportation, and they were accepting the lodging, and they were accepting the meals under 1353 as they were required, but they didn't think they could accept these registration fees, so they were scurrying to other authorities to try to find this stopgap kind of measure to fill that piece. And effectively, they kind of missed the boat. And then once people went afield into other authorities for that piece, it's been hard to herd people back into the umbrella of 1353 with respect to that piece. So when we look at what payments 1353 covers, we need to think about it, and people do normally think about it. It's a travel reimbursement regulation. It's designed to allow the federal government to receive reimbursement for travel-related expenses when you're sending your people on official travel to certain types of events away from duty station. So, of course, naturally, we recognize that what are your typical travel expenses? What do you voucher for typically? You voucher for
food, transportation, your lodging, local travel once you get to the place away from duty station, like your cab fares, things like that.
Exactly. So all of the common things that you have to get an authorization for, and you have to estimate in your authorization, and then when you come back you voucher for, clearly those are all sorts of things that fall within the ambit of 1353. But it also covers these training and conference fees. And training and conference fees are not something that I would, for example, put on my authorization or that I would voucher for after when I come back.
You might put that on a different form, maybe a training request form or something like that.
Exactly, exactly. So I think this is part of the reason why it initially got overlooked in people's understanding of what 1353 covered. But again, here's one of those things where you got to go to the regulations, folks, because the regulations contain all of this information. And at 41 CFR 304-2.1, when it talks about what do we mean by travel, subsistence, and related expenses, e.g., what can you accept under 1353, it clearly says, you know, all of the same types of expenses that are payable under the federal travel reg, et cetera, which are transportation, food, lodging, other travel-related services, all the stuff that we fully expect. But then it goes on to say, but it also includes conference or training fees in whole or in part. So clearly, right in the definition, it tells you, anytime you have a conference or training fee, you can also have that comped under 1353, but then it's a reportable expense.
Right, it's reportable on the 1353 report that comes to us twice a year.
Exactly. And then that piece goes on to say, as well as benefits that cannot be paid under applicable travel regs, but which are incident to the meeting, provided in kind and made available by the meeting sponsor to all attendees. And I think this piece kind of throws people for a loop, but it's really not that complicated. What that piece is trying to reach to is sometimes if you go to particularly fancy schmancy types of conferences,
right.
I don't think you would ever see this at a government-sponsored conference, or maybe you shouldn't see this at a government-sponsored conference, but at some private sector conferences, they will embed in the conference itself different sort of social activities.
Right, and sometimes entertainment and all sorts of things.
Exactly, that everybody who registers for the conference is allowed to attend. It's either integral to the registration fee, but somehow it's integrated into the conference, and all conference attendees are allowed to attend these events. So it could be a sporting event, it could be an entertainment thing, anything like that. That's integral or is incident to the meeting or similar function. That's all that provision is trying to talk about, is when you have those kinds of functions that are sort of attendant to the meeting itself that normally the government wouldn't pay for, or like you couldn't voucher for it.
You could never voucher for your Rangers tickets.
Exactly.
But if they're integral and given to everyone at the event, that could be accepted under this.
And it doesn't mean that you would have to accept it, but GSA is simply acknowledging that 1353 would allow you to accept those expenses in addition to what would typically be considered your travel and M&IE and those types of
And I think this makes sense because the check on excess here is that the reports are publicly available.
Right.
Right. So you might be able to under this authority accept the Rangers tickets, but that the check against doing so sort of willy-nilly is that then you have to report publicly that you have done so as an agency. Right.
So given the breadth and scope of 1353, I always like to start with that so that you really do understand how expansive the payment authority is, acceptance authority is under 1353. And we're going to get into the particularities of it, but I want you to understand, once you think you're in a situation that's a 1353 situation, you have to use 1353. And you have to use 1353 because you must use it. And why must you use it? You must use it because the statute says so. In 31 USC 1353b, it says specifically, except as provided in this section, and then it's in this section in 1353, and then it says, or section 4111 or 7342, and I'm going to talk about those in a second. But except for 4111 and 7342, this section, 1353, is the authority that you must use to accept a payment for expenses that are referred to, and in subsection A, it's all those expenses that we were just talking about, these travel and related expenses, in consideration for attendance at a meeting or similar function. So the statute itself is pretty explicit. Now, the carve-out for 4111 and 7342, just by way of your information, 4111 is the OPM, we refer to it in the vernacular as the OPM training reg. It allows, it's a gift to the employee. It allows for the acceptance of similar sorts of benefits for training at a non-federal facility, but the source of the payment has to be a 501c3, so there are certain conditions on that. And then likewise, 7342, as most of you would probably recognize, is the Foreign Gifts and Decorations Act.
Right.
So that would be for circumstances where you were the offerer of the gift was a foreign government or foreign entity for purposes of that restriction. And that really only relates to travel that takes place entirely outside of the continental United States. So all 1353 is doing there, all the statute is doing there, is tipping its hat to some other statutory authorities that might cover similar sorts of payments. But for the most part, it's saying once you're in 1353 land, you really have to stay in 1353 land.
Right, and I think an area that causes some concern for people or confusion is that it's the agency or the government that's doing the accepting under 1353. Right. That these are things that the agency or the government is accepting on behalf of the government, that these aren't gifts to the employee, him or herself.
Yes, it's an agency. I don't want to say 1353 is an agency gift acceptance authority because it's talking about payments from non-federal sources.
Right.
And really, but it is an appropriations law issue. It is an issue of absent some sort of authority to accept these payments that the government would otherwise be on the hook to pay. You're dealing with potentially an unauthorized augmentation of appropriations. So it is, in that sense, a gift acceptance authority, although that's not exactly how it's framed, or those aren't the definitions or terminology
it's
that
sort
it
of a
uses.
statutory exception to the prohibition against unauthorized augmentations.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's where there's a great deal of confusion, because it's like, well, the employee's still going, yeah, but it's really, it's a payment being received by the government.
Right. It's the government. The government otherwise would have had to pay to bear the, or have to bear the cost of this employee's attendance.
Right.
Okay. So again, let's just make sure that we understand the parameters for 1353. And 1353 is actually fairly simple. So it's when the employee is traveling in an official capacity, they're going to be attending an event that takes place away from duty station, and some or all of the costs that are associated with that event are being paid for by a non-federal source. Okay, generally, when you've got that set of factors, start with 1353 because it's pretty clear that you're very likely going to be in 1353 land. So, to put it in another way, the key concepts for 1353 are: is there going to be official participation? Because this is an agency gift acceptance thing, or an agency acceptance of payment. So the agency is only going to do it if you're attending in an official capacity. So the event has to be something you're doing in your official capacity. It's going to have to involve official travel, has to be away from duty station. Person has to have been cut travel orders in order to attend this event, okay? The event itself has to be a meeting or similar function, as that's defined in the reg. And then a non-federal source is offering to cover travel and related expenses, again, as those are defined in the regulation itself. So to sort of walk through this really quickly, with just a standard, easy, obvious example of when you would use 1353, you have the solicitor of labor has been invited to attend, and I've highlighted attend because we're going to do a variation on this theme in a minute, is invited to attend a 3-day symposium on labor law in Colorado. So in that first sentence, we can ascertain probably that we're looking at official participation, right, Patrick?
Yes, yeah, is, provided he's going to be attending as the solicitor of labor, which it seems to be the case here for sure.
Quite likely. And then it's in Colorado, which is not Washington, D.C., and my presumption is that the solicitor of labor's duty station is Washington, D.C.
I guess so.
So if they're going in their official capacity, they're clearly traveling in an official capacity, they're going to be cut travel orders. So then we get to that, and I think those things are obvious. I mean, I'm stating the obvious here, and I understand that, but just bear with me, okay? So is the event a meeting or similar function? Becomes one of the first questions you have to ask. So I'm gonna go down to the next slide because I've pulled up the actual reference to that in the regulation. And a meeting or similar function is a conference, a seminar, a speaking engagement, a symposium. Boom, symposium, bingo. We found our meeting or similar function. And again, I don't think meeting or similar function is necessarily a piece that gives people
a lot of difficulty.
A lot of
people
difficulty.
Sort of intuit this.
Yeah, so those things I think are fairly self-evident. Those parts don't seem to be the piece where people get hung up. It's on this next piece, okay? So the professional association is offering to pay for meals and is waiving the registration fee. So this becomes a matter of, okay, the professional association is a non-federal source,
right?
Okay? The question then becomes, are meals and the waiver of a registration fee things that can be accepted as travel and related expenses?
And this is where people tend to get confused in my experience.
It is. This is precisely where people get confused. And so we come back to that definition that I mentioned earlier, which is you can accept transportation, food, lodging.
Right.
So your meals are going to fall.
And I think this is the hard part, because it's any subset of the ones named here in the travel, subsistence, and related expenses.
Right.
Right. So just because they're not paying for the plane ticket doesn't mean that the meals aren't travel-related expenses.
Yes.
So we don't have to get wound around, well, they're not paying for you literally to get from your duty station to the front door, so they can't do anything further.
Right.
Because you're in travel status, the meals and similar and attendance fee are part of the travel expenses.
Yes, exactly. And that's a beautiful, I'm glad you pointed that out, because this is one of the points that I think we have to be really clear on. These discrete things that are identified in here do not have to be bundled. Any one of those things can be enough to trigger a 1353 authorization and a 1353 reporting requirement. So as you were saying, Patrick, again, to underscore, if anyone is offered any one of these things in connection with that event away from duty station, that is a payment that needs 1353 authorization and is reportable if it meets the reporting thresholds.
Right.
So one of the things that I think people get confused by too, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit later, but I kind of want to tee it up a little bit now, is under other authorities, this whole notion of quote-unquote free attendance does bundle things together. And you bundle several things together under free attendance, under a different set of authorities. Please do not bring that sensibility to 1353, because you do not bundle for purposes of 1353. You treat each piece as a discrete and separate thing.
That makes sense.
So again, why the confusion? I think the confusion in this area really comes with this bugaboo of waiver of fees. It's the waiver of the attendance fee that seems to give people most heartburn. And again, I think that the culprit here is another authority. I think a lot of folks have looked to the standards of conduct to inform their understanding about what things do and don't fall within the ambit of payments or gifts from non-federal sources.
Right.
And what I have to tell you, and I think Lenny definitely confirmed it last month, and I know part of the confusion is then there's been a lot of change in points of view and nuances and evolution in the response to these particular questions about when and under what circumstances is the registration fee something that does have to be reported and when is it something that doesn't have to be reported. I know there's confusion there because I know the answer has changed over the years. But the one thing I want you to understand is that 1353 is its own authority. It has its own definitions. It has its own internal logic, if you will. And so you do yourself a disservice and you make yourself a lot more miserable if you're trying to borrow concepts, definitions, or other concepts from other authorities and superimposing them or trying to make them fit within the logic of 1353.
Right, and I think this is one of those places where it's just really important in your own mind to think about what it is we're doing here. When we're talking about 1353, we're talking about what's fundamentally an appropriations question.
Yes.
And when we're talking about the standards of conduct, we're talking about those things that an employee can accept on his or her own behalf.
Right.
And those are just fundamentally distinct ideas.
Right.
So to try and borrow definitions or sort of other concepts from the rules about employees personally accepting gifts and apply them in an appropriations context, it is just going to lead you astray.
Yes.
So be clear when you start looking at an invitation or a proposed activity. are we fundamentally looking at an appropriations question, or is it better looked at as an ethics question? If you keep that straight, you'll go a long way to not confusing yourself.
Right. So let's just look squarely at waivers of fees, the conference and training fee piece of travel and other expenses that can be accepted under 1353. As a general proposition, as sort of the predicate under 1353, is that the waiver of a conference or training or other fee is a payment. It's a payment that can be authorized, and by extension has to be authorized under 1353 if it's being offered and accepted, and is potentially reportable under 1353 if it meets the certain thresholds. Okay, that's the predicate. Okay, so now we get to kind of the exception to the predicate, because every rule has its exceptions, right? Okay, under certain circumstances, however, the waiver or all or part of a conference fee may not require a 1353 authorization and is not reportable. And Lenny talked about that in his presentation last month, and I think this is one place where it's been kind of wobbly over the years, and there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of discussion. But what Lenny said last month is, when it comes to a waiver of a registration fee, 1353 authorization is not required, and these would not be reportable when the waiver of the registration fee is being offered to all speakers at the event. So in the first instance, we're really just looking at speakers and anybody who's invited and gets waived as a speaker, who gets their fees waived as a speaker. And what 1353, what Lenny said the 1353 take on this is, the only way it's not reportable is if all speakers are similarly situated, and it means that whatever that registration fee waiver looks like, it's being offered to all speakers at the event. So it doesn't matter if it's waiver of 1 day of registration or if it's waiver of all days of registration. The predicate is that, or the thing that allows it to not be reportable under 1353 or authorized is that it has to be to all speakers at the event.
And I think this actually kind of makes sense when we think about what kind of question we're answering here, in that because of this, if this policy is the case by the organizer that all speakers are going to all of the days, this isn't something that the government would otherwise have to pay for if they were, a differently situated organization. So therefore, there isn't a need to sort of suss out whether or not this is an inappropriate augmentation.
Right, right. But do notice, unlike G1, where and we're going to talk about G1 in a minute, that's the 2635.204 G1, which is the speaking or similar engagement where an employee is assigned to either speak or present information on behalf of the agency. And the standards of conduct under G1, it says, on the day that you're speaking, you can accept free attendance, and it's not a gift to you or to the agency. That G1 doesn't stipulate that it has to be all, that everybody else who's at the event has to be similarly, remunerated, as it were. So don't confuse G1. Don't take that concept of G1 and try to apply it in this situation. Lenny has said no, that the only time that registration fee waiver is not a 1353 payment is when it's being offered to all speakers at the event. So that's something you're going to have to ascertain if you've got somebody who's going to an event and speaking, and they're being offered
for those other days.
For those other days.
Other than when they're speaking.
The only other time the registration fee, according to Lenny, is not doesn't have to be authorized is if it's being offered to all federal government employees in attendance.
The logic here seems to be the same, is that, right, if the government was paying for your travel to the event, and you went to the event, they wouldn't incur a cost. So so it's not an inappropriate payment to the government.
Right.
Yep.
Now I want to underscore, my understanding is when we're talking about the waiver of the registration fee, we're only talking about the waiver of the registration fee. So any other travel, subsistence, or related expense that's being offered does still have to be authorized under 1353.
So plane ticket, taxi ride, laundry, etc.
Meals.
Yeah, all of that stuff has to be authorized under 1353. I think that makes sense.
Exactly.
Because those are certainly things that the government would otherwise have to pay for.
Yes, exactly, because the employee is still going to voucher for those things.
Right.
Okay, so we're going to take an example then, sort of riffing on that, what we just went over, which is, okay, so now we've got the solicitor of labor. It's basically the same fact pattern, except now the solicitor of labor has been invited to speak on day one of a 3-day symposium. And its professional association is offering to pay for the meals and waive the registration fee for the entire conference. So if we look at that under 1353, how does 1353 apply to that? Where there are two things that are being offered. One is meals,
Right.
and the other is the waiver of the fee.
Right.
So the meals are all going to have to be authorized,
Right.
whether they're only going to be there for a day or they're going to be there for 3 days, however many days there are, those meals are going to have to be authorized under 1353.
Right.
Okay? Waiver of the fee. Here's where we go back and we look at that little carve out. The fee would have to be authorized. That's your predicate, is that it does have to be authorized, unless all the speakers are having their fees waived or all government employees' fees are waived.
Yep.
So that's the quick and dirty analysis of that particular sort of carve out.
Okay, so we have a question here, and I think this gets to kind of the heart of the matter. So the question is, if registration is only paid to speakers on the day the speaker is speaking, but not on the other days, and the government is paying for travel, what do you use to accept those other days?
Okay, let me read that again. Okay. Can you read that to me again, Patrick?
Sure, and I think this gets to the fundamental sort of confusion, right? So I think what
Okay, so
what
the
our question
speaker is
is-
speaking on one day, okay?
and the fee is being waived for subsequent days. So say they're speaking on day 1, and on days 2 and 3 they've been invited to attend for free, but that's not true for all of the speakers. How would you accept the fee under day 2 and 3? And I think it's really clear here. We use 1353.
You use
we've reported.
1353, yes. What the distinction I'm drawing here is when you don't have to use 1353. The predicate is, if someone is offered a waiver of the registration fee, whether they're speaking or whether they're just attending, you have to accept it. You have to accept it under 1353, unless you have a situation where all the speakers are being offered the same registration. So what I would argue is that if a speaker is being offered a waiver of the registration fee that's being somehow done on a per diem basis,
Right.
and which most times it isn't. There's just a singular registration fee, and whether you're there for 1 day or 3 days. So sometimes we make these questions more complicated than they are actually even in reality. I mean,
Right.
it's just a waiver of the registration fee, and the registration fee is a singular registration fee.
Maybe it would be useful to look at this the other way. So in the case that all speakers' registration fee is being waived for the entirety of the event, we don't need 1353 because the government isn't receiving something that it would need an authority to accept.
Right.
If that's not true, then the government needs an authority to accept those things. So it would have to use 1353 to accept attendance on any other days except for the day the employee is speaking.
Right.
Which I think if you think about it that way, that might help, because you simply don't need an authority to go do something that you wouldn't have had to pay for anyway.
Right.
Right.
Right. So if again, the only time you don't have to worry about 1353 with a registration fee is if whatever's being offered to the employee is being offered to absolutely everybody else, and it covers them completely. Wherever they're not covered, through some mechanism that pulls it out from under 1353, then you go back and you look and say, well, would 1353 allow for it? And in this case, 1353 would allow you to accept it.
And then the government would have to decide if it wants to exercise 1353
Yeah.
to accept those things,
Yeah.
and then they'd be reported.
And the other thing I guess what I'm saying is, if 1353 allows you to accept the registration fee, why are you going to put yourself through the headache and heartache of slicing and dicing whether or not that you have to do the authorization for 1 day as opposed to 3 days? Just do the authorization for all the days. I mean,
And-
because
and
if it's not,
report
and report them, because at the end of the day, it's simply a matter of this authority is allowing you to send this person and attend, and allowing the government to not have to bear the full cost of the employee's attendance at these events. It's not meant to be an administrative nightmare. And so just because GSA is saying, well, if you have these circumstances where everybody's getting it, and whatever, that then you don't have to consider it under 1353. If that's going to make your life difficult, or it's going to make you feel like you're not
Right.
sure where to start or finish, just do a 1353 authorization for it.
Right, and report it.
And report it.
There aren't, there's no harm in over-reporting those things. But yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Okay, are we back on the slide?
Oh, sorry.
Oops, sorry. Okay. Okay, so now I want to do a different example, because this is one of the questions that came up when Lenny gave his presentation, and I think it's another place where people get really are concerned about whether and to what extent 1353 extends to these type of events. And this is the typical, speaker's dinner. So the solicitor is invited to attend a speaker's dinner the night before day one of the symposium, and the sponsor of the event is paying for the dinner, okay? So I think what you have to focus on here, there are a couple things to focus on, but the first thing you have to focus on is, what is the payment? What is the traveler-related payment that's being offered here? What are they comping here?
Right.
And what are they comping here in this situation?
There's a meal.
It's a meal.
Right.
Okay? So it's a meal like it's a meal. So that's the piece we have to look at. Somebody's offering our employee a meal, and so now we need to figure out whether or not it's something that 1353, that we can get in under 1353. So the questions you have to ask yourself are, is the speaker's dinner part of or related to the event for which the employee was placed in travel status?
Right.
So what was the event the employee was placed in travel status for? It was a symposium. The speaker's dinner is intimately related with the symposium.
Right.
So I would argue the speaker's dinner is a part of this event for which the employee was put in travel status.
Right.
So one of the payments that you can accept from a non-federal source in connection with attendance at a meeting or similar function is a payment of meals. So I would argue that anytime you have any kind of event like a speaker's dinner or something that is intimately related to the event for which you put the employee in travel status, what is being offered are things that are typical of your travel reimbursements, which are meals and maybe even some entertainment. I think that those things should be looked at first under 1353, and in most instances 1353 will allow you to accept them.
Yeah, allow the agency to accept those.
Would allow the agency to accept those under the guise of 1353.
Okay.
Where I think you would have to look to other authorities is if the dinner or event was something that was completely unrelated to the event for which you put the employee in travel status.
So in these situations, sometimes you'll have like an academic conference where you're sending an employee to present research they've done on behalf of the government. Mm-hmm. And maybe, for this, sometimes I've seen cases where because a lot of people from a particular field are getting together for this conference, subcommittees or other related groups will have their get-togethers or meetings in the same place at similar times, so everyone can travel at once. So the employee might also belong to a professional association, and that professional association is having a get-together. That might not be related to the purpose that they're there on behalf of the government, so then we'd have to look to something else.
Well, the other thing, too, that I think you need to consider as well is that you can do multiple meetings or similar functions under the same travel event. So if you have the primary event, which is the symposium or the event that's going on, and maybe there are going to be some other events that may or may not be intimately tied to the conference, but are clearly things that you are equally interested in having that person attend in an official duty capacity, e.g. the government would be willing to otherwise sort of bear the cost of that person's attendance, and they want them there in an official capacity. You can either, I think the first line of action is to say, we are treating this as all part of the same big event for which we're putting the person in travel status. I don't think we have to get really overly clever about how we deal with these. I think that it's in the agency's ability to define the breadth and scope of that event. So if you think that that event is the conference and events surrounding the conference that are related to the conference, and you just treat that whole thing as your meeting or similar function,
right,
then any meals and things like that that are associated with those events that are intimately tied to that event are all under the same umbrella.
Right. So our question is kind of, are these things that we want to send the employee in their official capacity to represent the United States government?
Right.
Right. And if that's true, they're there representing the government, they're there in their official capacity, then we should use 1353 because the
Right.
government should be the appropriate person or entity to accept these payments.
Right.
Only in those cases where the employee is going to be participating in a purely personal capacity would we have to look to do something else.
Well, I think you need to. I think you need to look at it very similarly to like when we talk about like what are like even sort of events that you would WAG in the local when somebody's working locally, and if it's something that you wouldn't, it's really the nature of the event and whether and to what extent it it has any real relatedness to the primary event. And again, whether or not this is something that you really want the person being there in their official capacity representing the United States government as part of that event. So, because the other piece too that I want to remind people is you aren't limited to a single non-federal source when you accept payments for attendance at a meeting or similar function. In the implementing regulation at 304.5-5.6, it says explicitly that you can accept payment from more than one non-federal source for a single trip, as long as the total of such payments do not exceed the total cost of the trip. So even when some of these other speakers' dinners or whatever are being underwritten or sponsored by somebody other than the sponsor of the primary event for which you put the person in travel status, you can still, under 1353, accept certain payments from various non-federal sources. It doesn't all have to be a singular non-federal source. So that's the application for that. Okay. So just a few rules of thumb for 1353. Again, if 1353 can be used, it generally must be used. But even in those circumstances where there other authorities might be permitted, as Lenny said in his presentation last month, I mean, you probably should use 1353 to the greatest extent possible. So for example, even if there's a situation where you could use the Foreign Gifts and Decorations Act, it might be better and more appropriate to use 1353. Because if the government is sending this person in their official capacity and there's an official reason for their attendance, then really if anybody's accepting anything, it should be on the government to be accepting any of these travel and related things that folks are getting. You shouldn't put that back on the employee and make that an employee gift acceptance. But in addition, we do have this transparency piece. We do have this accountability piece. One of the reasons why Congress wanted to make 1353 virtually an exclusive authority for these types of travel-related benefits was because there is this reporting requirement. So I think we want to be careful about, doing anything that would make it appear as if we're just trying to find ways to avoid having to report payments that are being received.
We don't want to be seen to be undermining the reporting requirement.
Right. Right. The second one was what I said early on, which is once you're in 1353, exhaust 1353 before you necessarily go running off looking for other authorities, because I do think that there's flexibility in 1353, and I do think that it allows for acceptance of many things that are in connection with whatever might be the primary event for which you've put someone in travel status. And Lenny has echoed that through the years too in all the presentations that I have done with him. And then finally, don't use definitions from other authorities when you're trying to apply 1353. Stick within 1353 and what it says you can and can't do. Okay, do we have a question on the Hangout?
Yeah, we do have a question. And the question is, can you accept free one-day training and a meal for IT-related personnel? Say they're not in official travel status per se, just attending the seminar away from duty station in the same city. They're not a speaker, but the training is free for all invited. And I think this is a really good question because it gets to that fundamental distinction between the gifts regulations and 1353. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Cheryl, that if they're not in their official capacity and they're not on travel orders, mm-hmm. then the government should not be using 1353 to accept this payment because they wouldn't otherwise be paying for it. Mm-hmm. But they may consider looking to the gifts regulations to see if the employee, him or herself, could attend.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one where you would have to look to some other authority. 1353 clearly would not do this for you, and we're going to sort of beat that drum here in a second with a few of these samples that I'm going to go through. But if it's if it's locally, if the event is happening locally, 1353 is automatically out the door. You can't use 1353 for anything other than events that are taking place away from duty station. But for any other type of training event where somebody is getting free attendance at a training event, there are a lot of questions that would have to be asked about that to determine what the authority would be to accept that. First, does the agency want them to attend it in their official capacity? If they do, then that's going to dictate what, if any, authorities you can use. So for example, you might be able to use 5 USC 4111, that OPM training reg. It depends on is the person who's sponsoring the training a 501c3? Does it meet the qualifications under 4111? So That's one possibility. If the agency says, no, we don't want to send you in your official capacity, we wouldn't bear the cost of that training or whatever, and it's training you're attending in your personal capacity, then it's going to depend. Is it, I think you have to look at the standards of conduct. If it's from a prohibited source, if the offer was being offered because of your official position, you'd have to do that analysis under the standards of conduct. So there isn't a definite answer to that question absent a lot more facts, but there would be other vehicles to accept it, yeah.
Yeah, so this is sort of a follow-on to that question. So say they were attending in their official capacity, but they weren't in official travel status. Well, they have to be in travel status for 1353, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be the threshold question, as you just mentioned, that, are they on travel orders? If they're not on travel orders, you're going to have to look somewhere else.
Right. So can we, the next person I know has a question about G1, but I've got some slides about G1, so
okay,
I'd kind of like
we'll circle back around
Yeah,
that.
if we can, and in the context of discussing that. So what I want to talk very briefly about, because we're coming up on we're running out of time here, but so once you're out of 1353, but you have to be out of 1353, then you can start looking to other authorities to accept waivers of fees, to accept other indicia or whatever of free attendance. So the three primary ones that I'm going to talk about today are agency statutory gift acceptance, 204G1, which is in the standards of conduct, and then 2635-204G2, which is the widely attended gathering exception. What I want to say about these, again, is that these other authorities should only be used once you have determined that 1353 does not apply, okay? Now, agency statutory gift acceptance, that's going to be a situation in which someone is participating in their official capacity in something, and whether or not the agency has the authority to accept certain things that might be offered to that employee in the context of that official duty activity. Similarly with G1, we're looking at accepting free attendance at certain events. They have to be there in an official duty status, and we're going to get to it in a minute, but it's only on the day that they're speaking or presenting information. And then we have G2. There we're dealing with personal capacity. So that is clearly outside the realm of 1353, because 1353, it has to be an official duty activity. Under 2635.204 G2, you're not authorizing the person to be there in anything other than a personal capacity. So just some really quick and dirty distinctions among those. So if we start with statutory gift acceptance authority, I just want to kind of highlight. So when would you use statutory gift acceptance authority in lieu of 1353? And that would be a situation where an employee is assigned to participate in an event in an official capacity, and obviously they're being offered something to offset the cost of that attendance, and the event is local. So whenever the event is local, we're out of 1353. If the event is away from duty station, then typically, if the event is away from duty station, you would use statutory gift acceptance only if it didn't meet the definition of a meeting or similar function.
Right.
So an example of something that wouldn't be a meeting or similar function would be like if you were out doing an investigation, if you were out at a meeting that was required to be done to engage in like the fulfillment of a statutory function, so a site visit, an investigation, anything that clearly falls within the realm of a statutory function of the agency, 1353 would not allow you to use that as an authority to accept travel-related expenses. So if you were going to do that, that would be a place where your statutory gift acceptance authority would be used.
And we're not suggesting that you have the statutory gift authority to accept those kinds of payments, but that if you were going to accept them on behalf of the government, you would need that authority.
Right. So to give you an example of a local event, this would be a classic local event where you could, if you have your gift acceptance authority and your gift acceptance authority allows for these kinds of things, then this would be the kind of event that 1353 wouldn't cover. A DC-based employee is attending a 3-day symposium, but it's taking place here in Washington, D.C., so it's a local event. The employee attends in an official capacity, okay? So it's not a widely attended gathering because they're there in their official capacity. The DC bar is sponsoring the event and offers the employee free attendance for all 3 days of the symposium. That would be a circumstance where if you have gift acceptance authority and it allows for this kind of thing, this would be a circumstance where 1353 wouldn't apply, but you could use your statutory gift acceptance authority to accept. Another example, the director of an agency in Washington, D.C. is invited to attend a gala in Washington, D.C., so it's a local event, not 1353, that will honor the public service of some current and retired government employees. The sponsor of the gala is a 501c3, and I'm going to say right up front, is not a lobbyist, so we don't have to deal with pledge issues. The sponsor is bearing the cost of the director's attendance. Okay? Now, people are probably saying to themselves, well, that sounds like a widely attended gathering, and that sounds like something that we would typically WAG. And that may very well be true. But you could also use your statutory gift acceptance authority to allow the director of your agency to attend that event, particularly if you thought it was an event where you clearly wanted them there
in their official capacity.
in their official capacity.
And in fact, it's probably best, if you're sort of progressing through which authorities we should be using to do which thing,
Right.
to look first to see if this would be appropriately accepted under your statutory gift acceptance authority before thinking about the widely attended gathering.
Right.
Only when you've exhausted that possibility should you look at the sort of path to attendance offered through G2.
Because I like to remind folks, the only reason G2 exists was because OGE recognized that not everybody has statutory gift acceptance authority. So OGE even said that in the preamble to the final rule. We created G2, we created this widely attended gathering exception because, for events that occur locally where you can't use 1353, there's no ubiquitous agency gift acceptance statute that would allow people to attend local events and accept free attendance.
In their official capacity.
In their official capacity. And we can't create a gift acceptance authority, a statutory gift acceptance authority. So we're going to try to fill that gap. But the implication being that for those people who have statutory gift acceptance authority, you can use that. And you probably should use that.
Right.
And for those who don't, or for those who don't think it would be appropriate for whatever reason under certain circumstances to have them there in that kind of...
Right. You can consider sending them in there, or you can consider whether or not they would like to attend in their personal capacity.
In their personal capacity.
Under G2.
Yes.
So it's another avenue for the employee to attend where the government can't accept the cost
Or
of
elects
attendance.
not to.
Or elects not to, yes.
Exactly. But it does not, G2 was never meant to preclude agencies from using their statutory gift acceptance authority for the very self-same events that they could otherwise use G2 for.
Right.
Okay. G1. Okay. So if 1353 doesn't apply and you've got a situation statutory gifts doesn't apply, you can look to G1 because G1 is going to be a little bit more limited because it's only going to apply when the employee is assigned to speak or present information on behalf of the agencies, e.g. they're there in their official capacity, officially assigned to speak or present information. And 1353 isn't going to apply if the event is local, so you could use G1 in a context where it would apply if the event is local, or in a context where the event is away from duty station, but it's not a meeting or similar function. So this is similar to like the limitations that would be on the use of the statutory gift acceptance authority.
So we'd first looked at 1353. If it
Yes.
doesn't fit into 1353 because it's local or it's not the right kind of function, then we can look at G1 and we can say actually this also wouldn't create an inappropriate supplementation to our appropriation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So example of G1. Solicitor of Labor, again, is invited to speak on day one of a 3-day symposium in Washington, D.C. So now it's a local event, okay? So we're not using 1353 because it's a local event. The D.C. Bar is sponsoring the event and offers the solicitor free attendance on the day she is speaking. So this would be a classic G1 situation. It's a local event, it's a speaking engagement, and the solicitor is being offered free attendance in connection with just the day they're speaking. That's fully how one would use G1. I was trying to think of an example of where you could use G1 away from duty station, but I couldn't come up with one, to be quite honest with you. And then we finally get to G2. And G2, again, the critical piece with G2 is just to remember that you're going to use that when the event, there's an offer free attendance, and the event, as an initial matter, qualifies as a widely attended gathering,
Right.
as we define that. But it's only when the employee is not going to be assigned to attend in an official capacity.
Right.
They cannot be there in sort of like their official capacity function and not on government time. It has to be other than on sort of official duty time, as it were.
Right. So they have to be in a leave status or it has to be outside of business hours.
Yes. So this can occur either when the event is local, but what I want to underscore here is you can use G2 in other than local events. You could WAG an event that's taking place even when the employee is in travel status away from duty station. But whenever you're having an event that's happening in conjunction with travel, You're going to want to make sure that 1353 doesn't take care of it first before, and that it's not something that you actually want them to do in their official capacity before you start running down the G2 rabbit hole.
Right. So these would be events that maybe are just happen to be away from duty station on a travel trip that you wouldn't normally send them in their official capacity, and you don't elect to in this case.
Right. Now this one might be a colorable one. It might be where you would see that there was, only from the standpoint of you might see this as more of an official duty thing, but I think this is a pretty good example of where you might want to use G2 when someone's on travel. So the situation we have is the employee's in travel status. They're conducting a site visit at a non-governmental facility.
Okay.
So if they're conducting a site visit at a non-governmental facility, anything that's associated with that, you couldn't accept any payments under 1353 for that event. That would not be a 1353 event.
Right. It's not a meeting or similar function. It's also you're carrying out your statutory required duties as an agency. Exactly.
So the agency would not be allowed to accept travel reimbursements and expenses from a non-federal source in conjunction with that site visit.
Okay.
But while the person's out there, they happen to be invited by a local contractor to attend a dinner that's going to be in honor of the local congressman and in celebration of the opening of a new government facility.
Okay.
So we have a congressman who probably got, money to help build the facility, and so they're going to have a big celebration in the location where this person is currently on TDY. This would be one where that might very well be an event that, it's in the agency's interest. I mean, you'd have to do the whole G2 analysis. Is it in the agency's interest for the person to attend, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the type of thing where you could G2 this kind of an event, even though they're away from duty station
right.
for other purposes. And that's what I had by way of examples. So if, I think we had a G1 question that we were going to try to look at now.
Sure,
that we had,
and I think we may have taken care of it, but let's just make sure.
Okay.
If all speakers have registration fees waived and it's out of 1353, do you have to separately approve under G1?
This is where G1 is, it's helping people understand G1 gets a little complicated, because G1 really isn't an authority.
It's sort of a recognition
Yeah.
that when you attend an event to speak, that the government isn't receiving something that it should have properly paid for. Mm-hmm. So there is no unauthorized supplementation of appropriation, right? That stricter reading of the appropriation law would basically say that anytime the government sends someone to speak or share policy guidance or do whatever, that we'll have to pay for the chairs and the lights and the air conditioning in the venue, and that would sort of be absurd and a sort of an undue restriction on agencies' ability to carry out their functions. So what G1 in my mind says is that if you're going to speak on behalf of the government, you can't carry out that function, which presumably your agency has the statutory authority to carry out, without being there.
Right.
So it would be absurd to say that you need a special authority to accept the being there
Right.
in order to do the speaking, which you're fully authorized to do.
Right. I mean, and I think it's sort of a commonsensical thing, and it's got to be based in some sort of appropriations opinion from somewhere, somehow. And my assumption has always been that GAO must somewhere have rendered an opinion that says that the government should not be deemed to be engaging in an unauthorized augmentation of appropriations simply because when they send someone to a location to speak, they aren't forced to pay to physically be present in the room where they've been asked to speak. So, that it's not really an augmentation of appropriations,
right,
as much as it's just kind of a consideration for the services that are being provided by the government.
Exactly. It's sort of a necessary part of carrying out the authorized function.
Right. So G1 is basically just saying, look, we're just acknowledging that if you're going someplace to speak in an official capacity, the government doesn't have to pay for you to be there on that day. And the fact that you're not paying for being there on that day is not going to be considered a gift to the government or to the employee. So in those circumstances, we don't have to look at it. We don't have to look at it from an agency appropriation standpoint, and neither do we have to look at it from a personal gift. So it doesn't suddenly become transformed into a personal gift just because we don't think
Right.
it's an
a government official
issue.
who's speaking officially isn't receiving something personally because they get to stand on the stage or sit at the table.
Right.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
And here's a question about 1353, which is probably covered in the federal travel reg. But do you know if there's a dollar limit on meals that can be accepted under 1353?
There are, now you're getting into the travel reg part of itself that I don't have as much experience with. I know that there are certain limitations that apply. I really don't want to. I don't want to punt on that because I really don't. I'm not sure what if any limitations there are on the dollar values. And I think Lenny may have addressed that somewhat in this presentation last month.
And I would encourage you just to look through the relevant sections of the FTR.
Right.
It's laid out in sort of a frequently asked questions way and walks you kind of clearly through the process. And if there are decisions or determinations you need to make, it lays them out pretty clearly. So that's the sort of thing I always have to look up, and I just sort of go through the process there. And I think this last question, which I think is going to be the last question we have time for, is a common one. So would an example of a place in which we would use G2 or the WAG be kind of a reception following a conference that the employee had attended officially if the reception is not hosted by the conference organizer, but maybe one of the sponsors or someone at the conference had invited everyone from the conference to attend. So sometimes you'll have a vendor or someone that has an event after hours, and they say, if you went to the conference, bring your badge and you get in free. Maybe the government says, we don't want to send you to the happy hour for free in your official capacity. We don't want to accept that under 1353. Would that be an example of a place you might consider doing G2?
Well, you've raised a good point, Patrick, which is to say just because you can accept something under 1353 doesn't mean you have to.
Right.
Okay? So I think it becomes a matter of agency sensibility about that. Frankly, I think it's something you could accept under 1353. It's intimately related to the conference. It's like the capstone event of the conference. It's a different non-federal source that's offering it, and all attendees are invited to it. So I think it falls squarely within 1353. But if for whatever reason, because of the nature of the event, you don't feel comfortable having it be like an officially sanctioned, blessed thing.
Yeah, so maybe it's
but then I don't know how you can WAG it, because under the WAG, then you have to say there's an agency interest in the person's attendance. So I think if you're okay with them attending and you don't see anything untoward or inappropriate about it, then if you're going to allow them to attend, I would do it under 1353. Based on the facts that you've presented here, I would not WAG something like that.
Okay, excellent.
I mean, I just think it would be more appropriate under 1353, and I think 1353 accommodates it. And whenever you can use 1353, you're supposed to use 1353.
Excellent.
Do we have any questions on the phone? I don't want to short
Oh, no, we do have. We just have about a minute or two left. Could we open up the phone line for questions, please, Diane?
Yes, thank you. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 and record your name. Again, at this time, to ask a question, please press star 1. One moment for questions.
Yeah, this is an area that's clearly, it's hard to sort of winnow it down to...
And depending on the event, there's not always a sort of obvious workflow to go through. If certain things happen, you should probably go straight to the gifts regulations.
Right.
In other cases, you should work your way through the authorities that allow the government to accept payments, and only when you've exhausted them maybe consider the gifts regulations.
Right.
But it's difficult sometimes on the front end when the employee comes into your office to know which situation you should be dealing with.
Right.
And so we did have a question. Question comes from Roxanne. Your line is open.
Hi, Roxanne.
Hi, Roxanne.
Thank you. I had a question on G2. If an employee is invited to attend an event that's away from their duty station, and they're not speaking, so they're attending in their personal capacity, and the conference provider has offered to pay their travel expenses or hotel expenses, what would that fall under?
Well, it wouldn't be 1353 because they have to be in their official capacity in order for 1353 to apply. So you would have to look at I would presume at, I don't know whether, you would have to look at some other authorities. I don't know whether 4111, 5 USC 4111 would allow for attendance in a personal capacity. I'm not as familiar with 4111. You might want to take a look at that, Roxanne, because that would allow for those kinds of payments for like lodging and transportation and things like that.
But for 1353, it's just a must. You must be there officially because the government's going to accept this payment.
And the G2 is only going to get you the free attendance at the event and the meals, but it's not going to get you any other travel-related expenses that are associated with it, which would be like for lodging or the transportation to and from the event venue.
Right. So I think this is another case where you want to think about the gifts analysis. So if the employee is going to be there in their personal capacity, they're on a trip maybe on the weekend or something, you're not putting them in an official travel status, and you're doing your gifts analysis, first I'd try and determine whether or not the travel payment being offered is even prohibited under
Right.
Subpart B. Is it from a prohibited source? Is it being given because of their official position? If it doesn't meet the general prohibition, it may be appropriate for them to accept it.
Right.
Alternatively, one of the other exceptions might apply. You might be able to look at the exception at 204E if it's related to an outside business activity, or perhaps the personal relationship exception. So, be sure to do your whole gift analysis if they're going to be there personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just the bottom line, is that you just have to look at other available authorities. And once one authority is no longer available to you, I think it's just a matter of exhausting whatever other authorities that are out there. And the ones that I'm aware of that might, like I said, might reach to personal capacity attendance, although I'm not entirely clear, would be possibly 4111. And then once you're out of that, then I would suggest it would have to be, as Patrick said, a gifts analysis as to whether or not it would be a prohibited gift.
Yep. Excellent. Well, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Roxanne. All right. Well, it's exactly the top of the hour, Cheryl.
It is exactly
So we
top of the
timed
hour.
that pretty well. So thanks very much, Cheryl, for joining us. And thank you all for joining us. You will receive your course evaluation at the end of the presentation. We do ask that you complete those, and if you have ideas for future training, please let us know, because we'd be happy to offer those things that you're most interested in. So until next time.
Thanks very much.